welcome to the Afterglow podcast, a space to practice Yoga Nidra informed by the ideas of Carl Jung and internal family systems. Each week we will work on a different life theme, giving us the opportunity to discover vast inner landscapes, sitting with all that life has to offer as we explore who we are. May the afterglow be as bright as the journey is deep. Hi, welcome to this week's episode, where I'm going to be talking about loneliness and the inner companion. This episode is focusing on building a relationship with self with a capital S, lessening the feelings of internal loneliness and circumambulating the feeling of yearning. But I want to spend a few moments talking about social loneliness. For anyone who started this episode thinking that it was going to be about social loneliness, I just want to say a few words. And while this episode is not on social loneliness, largely because at its deepest core, this podcast is a companion to inner work. And the main reason I am taking this time to mention social loneliness is because I think that it is incredibly common for people to try and spiritually bypass their social loneliness. I think the inverse of this episode that we're going to be doing today, the inverse is encouraging people who are potentially overindulging in their inner world at the cost of their social needs. In the world of people with spiritual leanings, people who have a high appetite for being self-focused, I find that there's often a correlation with there being a high rate of spiritual bypassing where they try and cure their loneliness or their desire for relatedness with excessive meditation or different practices, hoping that they can evolve those needs through some kind of self-work, inner work, spiritual practice, and that they can sort of get beyond loneliness, get beyond social needs. I'm trying to point at something quite specific, but very common. Please do not confuse this episode as a tool to sublimate social loneliness. This episode is a call to people who feel a sense of disconnect with themselves, who feel a sense of existential loneliness, who sense that there is something more to themselves that they can begin to explore, but for whatever reason they feel unsure of how to begin. Before I dive in, I will share warm encouragement to anyone who feels a lack of external relatedness, and I hope that you find some comfort and true connection in that regard. Now, what do I mean by inner loneliness? Well, it can often show up in social loneliness. It can look and feel like disconnect, a sense of being lost or numb, unsure of yourself, self-critical. But mostly I'm interested in the feeling of yearning, a sense of longing for a more enriched experience of life, of friendships, of work or interests, but also that elusive something inside that is hard to describe. For all of the self-help books I have read, few, if any, speak about a yearning, a mysterious want for internal comfort. To some people, this seems to be an apparent want from childhood. And if you are one of those people and you are listening, you likely know exactly what I'm talking about. While for others, this concept is a mystery, and yet they will complain of feeling numb or despondent, confused, having difficulty understanding how they feel. So I'd like to start by talking about a famous writer, a writer who wears several masks depending on which of his books you have read. A writer who made introversion into a work of art and who was awarded a Nobel Prize for his ability to describe the intense loneliness of the human soul. Around 25 or 26, I began reading a lot more Hermann Hesse. And somehow Hesse entered my life holding hands with Carl Jung. For anyone who has read several Hesse books, I'm thinking specifically of The Glass Bead Game and Steppenwolf, you will suspect that Hesse's life was spent wrestling a sense of loneliness and despair. He would binge on socializing only to retreat into himself and stay in a space of deep internal isolation. Jung writes extensively on the balancing of the tension of the opposites from a psychological framework, while Hesse uses his fiction, his characters and stories to illustrate these points of tension. The most stark version of this is Hesse's novel Narcissus and Goldmund, two versions of himself, the one hungry for sense pleasure and exhilaration, and the other focused only on a dedication to spiritual clarity, to being connected to God and to self. Permeating all of Hesse's work is this intense sense of loneliness, of needing desperately to find a way to himself and feeling bereft when he cannot get there because he feels trapped by base desires. One of my favorite Hesse quotes is from Steppenwolf. It reads, "We intellectuals, instead of fighting this tendency like men and rendering obedience to the spirit, the logos, the word, and gaining a hearing for it, are all dreaming of a speech without words that utters the inexpressible and gives form to the formless." There is a Hesse phenomenon that people have written about. There are essays written on it, even podcast episodes about this phenomenon. And the phenomenon is that young people read his work and they over-identify with his repeated theme of self-isolation, of existential loneliness. And they form an arrested development because they have romanticized this very real feeling that we all experience at some stage. Because Hesse's writing is of such a remarkably high standard, and because he weaves spiritual seeking and a deep internal yearning into his work, it is all the more intoxicating to stay in the realm of his characters and isolate oneself with the self-assertion that doing so has some spiritual nobility to it. To be very clear, I don't think this demerits Hesse as a person, a thinker, or a writer, nor is this a danger to warn people of when they read Hesse. Rather, I think that it's an interesting phenomenon in that the people who get stuck in this space of overly identifying with this lone wolf outsider spiritual seeker, I think that they're likely relating very deeply to something that Hesse captures extremely well, and that is wanting so deeply to connect with something within themselves and feeling truly bereft at being incapable of doing it or at succeeding in maintaining that connection. Hesse is unusually effective at putting extremely complex internal strife and yearnings and cloudiness into words. Both in his fiction and non-fiction, he is able to rise out of the page and step into your psyche and turn the light on and say, "I see you." I think reading Hesse is a remarkable experience, and I recommend him wholeheartedly to anyone who I think is in a space of internal conflict and feeling a sense of wanting to connect with something inside of themselves and resisting it or not knowing how to do that dance. But Hesse, the person, he developed beyond the characters in his novels. He continued to evolve spiritually. He went into analysis with Jung, and as he aged, he wrote many more essays and poems and did a lot of art. And I believe, based on letters that I've read from him and accounts from people in his later years, that he really managed to achieve what he set out to do. But I think that if you just read some of his early novels and you forget that he is capturing a very specific moment in life or on a personal journey, I think it can be very intoxicating to romanticize that space and try and stay in it, because it has a grit to it that feels and fits quite nicely with people who have that intense, forlorn isolation and are seeking to find a way to connect to something that is more whole and sustainable. Of course, you don't need to have read Hesse to know this feeling. Everyone experiences it for shorter or longer periods, depending on their nature. Hesse just speaks very well to it, and you're in good company if that is the space that you're in. And I do think that this is a spectrum. For some people, they can't look away from the internal chasm. They are spellbound by that yearning, and they spend their lives trying to fill it. Jung was very influential in the building blocks of the AAA program, and the AA program and Jung assert that the core crisis for alcoholics is a spiritual crisis. And whether it is spiritual in terms of a religious practice or a meditation practice, whether it is a deepening of connection with self through Jungian work, whatever it may be, I think that for a lot of people, they cannot help but stare consistently at this chasm, and they may not even realize how constantly they're doing it. They're so used to it. And for other people, there is a light frivolity. There is a sort of reckless abandon way of being in the world and enjoying the delights of pleasure senses and the fun of life, and they're seemingly incapable of being struck like lightning by these existential crises that are so haunting for others. There is a spectrum, and we all have met people on both sides. So my intention for this episode is to essentially, for anyone anywhere on that spectrum of yearning, and they're curious about trying to be more conscious in building a relationship with their self with a capital S, or a higher self, or a sort of spiritual guide, however you want to see it. I will talk in a short while about ways in which you can see this in a companion, but I think that it is a really beneficial starting point to getting into inner work. And I think that it can really help, especially if people feel a little bit alienated or a little bit uncertain as to how they're going to feel, or having a sense of being very lonely inside of their own minds, and that can feel really intimidating. So if that sounds like something you would like to have or experiment with, hopefully this Yoga Nidra can be of service in that way. And very often when we meditate, we do have an experience of connecting with self. Sometimes when we're hiking alone, or lying on our backs, swimming in the ocean, or writing, or some moment when we are filled with a wonderful feeling of quiet awe and connectedness. I will explain how it sometimes can feel for me, but that doesn't mean it always has to feel that way for me, nor that it has to feel that way for you. And I think that when you have the experience of connecting with self, whether it happens immediately. For some people, when I run Yoga Nidra classes and we do, in more traditional Yoga Nidra, we would call it Ishta Devata, but in slightly more westernized versions of Yoga Nidra, I refer to it as the inner companion. And sometimes people have a really rapid response. And we do the practice once and I can see them crying. I can see the tears just flowing out of their eyes. They're silent, their eyes are closed, they're not moving, but they're having a really profound internal experience, and the tears are just flowing. And they've just been waiting for somebody to open that door and for them to meet a part of themselves, an internal part of themselves that really unlocks a deep feeling of safety, of belonging, of recognition, of relief. And it's often followed or experienced alongside what I can only describe as an ecstatic gratitude. And for other people, they have to do this practice a while, several times. Or they find it in a different way. So there's no guaranteeing that it's going to just immediately happen, but it is absolutely possible that it does happen immediately, because I've witnessed it so many times. And yeah, and you don't need to continue doing whole full-blown Yoga Nidra practices every time you want to connect with the inner companion. But the Yoga Nidra practice is just a really good way of easing you in, of giving you a sense of how to do this kind of work, of what it can feel like to be in that space of semi-wakefulness, semi-sleep. And yeah, and I think that especially for people who are resistant to doing inner work, it can be super helpful to have this inner companion as a real anchor, a profound anchor that can help them feel stable and give them a sense of reassurance, especially when there can be really murky stuff that comes up. And it's extremely valuable to have that inner companion to call to at any moment and feel their embrace in whatever form that means, or however it appears to you, because the inner companion may not have a human form in how you witness it. But yeah, so I also want to just take a moment to talk about, how this practice can look beyond just the introductory process. The Yoga Nidra that I'm going to be uploading in a few days, that is, in a way I'm opening a door, but really I feel like you're opening the door. I am, if anything, giving you a welcome mat, and then you can open the door and start to do this kind of work. And, going forward, you can connect with that inner companion as much as you want. It can be a daily practice. You can open up your eyes in the morning and say, I know you're there and thank you for loving me, for example. Or before you go to sleep at night, you can say, like, please be with me in my dreams. You can call to it when you're in a moment of emotional turmoil. You can tell it about your day. There's a lot that you can do. You can, you can ask for it to help you with a real conundrum of a problem, and you can let go of it and ask your inner companion to come back with some suggestions. I actually have a whole episode on that, which is called The Cocoon. And it's one of my favorite episodes because it does exactly that, of letting some higher part of you, or the self with a capital S, assist in providing possible alternative options. To use Jung language, a third space presents itself. But I don't want to get too stuck into that right now. I think that essentially I'm trying to illustrate that there's a lot of ways that you can create daily practices with your inner companion. And you can also, just do it every now and then as you need it. It doesn't have to become a new lifestyle either. But the essential thing is to get it a little bit comfortable with having that feeling of connectivity to a part of you that feels really stable and extremely loving and able to give you the best guidance that any part of you can. So self is an archetype. A lot of people don't realize that self with a capital S is an archetype. It is the closest, most important aspect of the psyche, and maintaining connection to self is both arguably the ultimate goal of individuation, and it is the most encouraging aspect along the way. I didn't call this episode connecting with self or alleviating existential loneliness with self, because I don't think that people have to necessarily adopt a specifically Jungian stance on it. I think that even holding the concept of an internal companion is already, enough of a sort of entry point to engage with this kind of thing. Because I think sometimes we can get caught up in the language and how it is so specific to different modalities. And I'm trying in all of this work to create a common tongue across these modalities. For example, the fact that Yoga Nidra, active imagination, IFS, they're all essentially the same thing. Lucid dreaming is the same. They might have slightly different steps involved, or they might have their own little flair here or there, but the essential core aspect of it, it's the same thing. It is engaging with different figures or landscapes on the internal plane while maintaining a connection with consciousness, i.e. not dreaming, because we can easily connect with figures and landscapes, and we do it every night when we dream. But the thing to highlight is that there is a maintaining of consciousness and finding a balance where the ego becomes an observer and not the narrator. And in the same way, it doesn't need to be seen as the self, it can be seen as an inner companion. I hope that the invitation in this episode is to be interested in engaging more consciously and maybe even more conscientiously with self. I don't believe it is good to create systems around it or apply any pressure, but rather to just open the door and give yourself permission to enter that space, because it's really wonderful to have it when you need it, and to have a tool to give you comfort and grounding and a sense of internal connectedness. Your path will be different to everyone else's, of course. So, just don't worry about whether you're doing it right or wrong. And don't worry about finding a perfect routine with this kind of stuff or feeling any way or other about it. Okay, so I'm going to just pivot for a little bit and talk about what I mean by inner companion in terms of how you might want to visualize it or create like a certain sort of symbol or anything like that. So this can be, it can be anything that you want to picture it as. You can have an idea already before you go in. That's not uncommon. Some people do start off with an image of, to use the classic Yoga Nidra terminology, their Ishtadevata, which is a higher being or deity. Some people, if they have a relationship with Jesus or Muhammad or Archangel Michael or a specific saint, or there is like a teacher, a really sort of highly regarded meditation teacher, perhaps the Buddha, anyone like that. So some people already have a sort of go-to spiritual figure, and they like to use that as their starting off point. I think that's fine, as long as you know that it is not them, that there is something in them that you are connecting to, that you feel a sense of relatedness towards. It is you that you're connecting with. It's not that you're connecting with that saint is not in your brain. It's kind of irrelevant trying to make these stipulations and draw these lines. I don't even care if they are or aren't, but I think the more important thing to get across is that you're connecting with yourself and you're trying to find a visual form of comfort within yourself. And as you get more comfortable, that symbol of that figure will transform over time. It might transform multiple times. So it doesn't matter if you want to start off by using, for comfort, a spiritual teacher or a writer you really love, somebody that you feel a great sense of connectedness to, and you feel like a real sort of existential relatability or a leaning towards. It's okay to use them as this sort of internal symbol, as long as you're happy to allow it to present itself to you differently as it needs to over time. And that does not mean that it needs to suddenly one day show up as your mother or father. That should never be the case, even if you have a positive relationship with one of your parents, or both your parents. It's just too subjective. It's not advisable. It's too subjective. Yeah, so sometimes these figures can suddenly appear as someone else, and I would say that that's not yourself with a capital S. That's not that's some other ego projection or something like that. Don't worry too much about that. I'm not saying that it's something that you need to suddenly be really like vigilant towards, but more just that you know that it's yourself when it is when it approaches you with just endless love and infinite capacity for kindness, for compassion, even if the message might be stern, you will know, you will have a sense of, or an intuition or instinct that what is being felt is real love and kindness. But yeah, so be willing to let the symbol, sort of change over time. It might for a while, it might take the shape of a bird or a tree. There are typical images that get used, sort of collective unconscious images, like, a tree is a very common symbol for the self. The ocean is typically a symbol of the unconscious, but it is also a spiritual symbol of unity and connectedness. So for some people, there is a bit of a sort of watery kind of figure. But for the most part, I would say people tend to either see it as themselves, sometimes an older version of themselves. That seems to be quite a neutral visual depiction. Some people like to make it really nebulous, and they want it to be just a sort of golden ball of energy, or a a figure from art of God, or a saint that they really love. So, you can kind of play around with it. You can also just go in and if you feel a bit sort of confident and you want to test it out, you can go in and just have no expectations and just see what presents itself to you, because it's possible that your unconscious mind might have better ideas than your conscious mind about what it should look like. Obviously, if it looks like a skull and crossbones, it's probably, again, it's probably your ego conscious just kind of, or some tricks to energy that's kind of trying to, I don't know, resist. That's probably what is happening. There's probably a little bit of resistance in you, and it's showing up by doing that and trying to sort of make a mockery of the practice. And that's normal. Just kind of keep going. And, to use an IFS practice, you can ask that energy to just kind of step aside and, sort of say, thank you, I see you, but I'm actually doing something here that I'm really excited about. Do you mind moving to the side? We're going to be fine. This is an okay practice. Things are safe. You can do stuff like that if you want to incorporate a little bit of IFS, but you probably won't have that. It's not very common. When we do this kind of Yoga Nidra work, the vast majority of the time is that people have quite a rapid sense of connection to an inner figure for their inner companion. And I would say it's predominantly one that they came in with already. It's not very often when, especially at the beginning, they just go in with nothing and then come out with something, unless they're an especially atheistic leaning person who has a great sort of sense of self-pride in not having any spiritual teachers. Those ones are the ones that typically go in with no visual sort of assumptions of what it's going to look like, and they come out with some real cool, weird, wacky, interesting stuff. And I think that, it's great. So either one's fine. There's no right or wrong in any of this. Don't worry about it too much. I'm giving you a lot of general information because this is a podcast and I have no insight into the individuals listening. So I'm just trying to give a little bit of blanket information that's hopefully going to cover a lot of the bases for most people. And then, it can be a familiar. You can see it as a familiar at first. Some people find it too intimidating. They find that there's almost like they have an assumption that there's a hierarchical structure with the self with a capital S, and that it's almost too intimidating to engage with. And so they prefer to have something that's like a familiar that feels slightly closer to their level. That is, honestly, it's just a perception thing. I don't think that it's necessarily I wouldn't worry too much about, the measuring of these things. But I think it's totally fine if somebody wants to, imagine that it's a caracal or a trying to think of real examples of ones that people have told me about. Phoenix is a common one. One person has said the green man. He's not an animal, but somebody said the green man. For some people, it's a mountain, or it's hyper specific. It'll be like a pool, a beautiful, pristine pool of water on top of a high mountain where no one can go, and it reflects the sky. And for other people, it's the concept of Mother Nature, and they get it like an embodied depiction of Mother Nature coming through, and she can kind of look a little bit like angelic, or kind of like a watercolor painting or something like that. So, I think that there's a lot of freedom here. I think for the most part, people have a sense of what their comfort level is before they even go in. So just have fun and don't worry about having it perfectly right the first time. Okay, so just as we're about to wrap up, just one more reminder that this is a welcome mat and you are opening the door if you want to, and it's a wonderful journey to begin, and presumably you're already feeling some kind of pull if you're listening to a podcast like this. And I hope that as you gain familiarity and a sense of comfort with these kinds of internal check-ins and building relationships with self or inner companion or whatever language you want to use, and generally just being able to sit with yourself when you need to. All of these moments, even if they really are just moments at a time, you are creating long-lasting internal connections and heeding the call of that yearning. So I'm going to close off by reading a quote from Hermann Hesse from his book Reflections. We must become so alone, so utterly alone, that we withdraw into our innermost self. It is a way of bitter suffering, but when our solitude is overcome, we are no longer alone, for we find that our innermost self is the Spirit, that it is God, the indivisible, and suddenly we find ourselves in the midst of the world, yet undisturbed by its multiplicity. For our innermost soul, we know ourselves to be one with all being. Thank you for joining us for this weekly companion episode. It really does add to the experience that you. The Yoga Nidra will be uploaded in a few days, giving you time to reflect on the questions that I've asked you. Please subscribe to receive notifications for this new Yoga Nidra episode as well as for future ones. Thank you for adding your light and kindness to the world and for doing this important inner work. May the afterglow be as bright as the journey is deep. See you soon.